To remove the base enclosure, first turn the unit upside down. Detach the 7 Phillips No. 1 screws that secure the base enclosure to the top cover. Note that the 4 screws located near the rear of the base enclosure are of a longer length than the 3 screws located near the front of the base enclosure. Grasp the base enclosure at the center rear of the enclosure and firmly pry up around the edges to remove the base enclosure from the unit. Reverse this procedure to install the base enclosure. To remove a rubber foot, first remove the base enclosure. Push through the inside of the base enclosure with a paper clip or similar pointed tool to help release the rubber foot from the base enclosure and pull the rubber foot off of the cover. Reverse this procedure to install a rubber foot. To remove the battery, first remove the base enclosure. Detach the 3 Phillips No. 1 screws that secure the battery inside the unit. Tip the rear edge of the battery up and pull the battery out of the unit. Reverse this procedure to install the battery. To remove the audio board, first remove the base enclosure. And the battery. Flip up the latch for the audio board flat ribbon connector on the board and use the blue pull tab to gently pull the connector out of its port on the board. Caution: take care to use minimal force on the flat ribbon connector to avoid damaging the connector and ribbon cable. Detach the Phillips No. 1 screw securing the audio board to the top cover. Pull the audio board out of the unit. Reverse this procedure to install an audio board. To remove the CPU fan, first remove the base enclosure and the battery. Detach the CPU fan connector from the motherboard. Detach the speaker connector from the motherboard. Pull the speaker connector out of the guides on the side of the CPU fan. Remove the mylar covering the wireless LAN antennas on the wireless LAN board. Carefully detach the antennas from the board. Pull the wireless LAN antenna cables out of the cable guides on the side of the CPU fan. Detach the 2 Phillips No. 1 screws that secure the CPU fan to the motherboard. Carefully lift the fan off of the motherboard, being careful of the cables at the side of the fan. Reverse this procedure to install a CPU fan. To remove the VGA fan, first remove the base enclosure and the battery. Carefully remove the EDB cable from the cable guides on the side of the fan. Detach the fan connector from the motherboard. Detach the 2 Phillips No. 1 screws that secure the fan to the motherboard. Carefully lift the fan off of the motherboard, being careful of the EDP cable at the edge of the fan. Reverse this procedure to install a VGA fan. To remove the heatsink, first remove the base enclosure, the battery, the VGA fan, and the CPU fan. Detach the 7 Phillips No. 1 screws, securing the heatsink over the CPU and GPU on the motherboard. Carefully lift the heatsink up and off of the CPU and GPU and out of the unit. Reverse this procedure to install a heatsink. To remove the hard drive, first remove the base enclosure and the battery. Flip up the latch for the hard drive flat ribbon connector on the motherboard and use the blue pull tab to gently pull the connector out of its port on the motherboard. Caution: take care to use minimal force on the flat ribbon connector to avoid damaging the connector and ribbon cable. Detach the 4 Phillips No. 1 screws for the hard drive and pull the hard drive assembly out of the unit. Carefully pry the flat ribbon adhesive off of the hard drive and disconnect the hard drive connector from the hard drive. Reserve the connector for the replacement drive. Detach the 4 Phillips No. 1 screws securing the hard drive to the hard drive brackets. Pull the brackets off of the hard drive. Reserve the brackets for use with the replacement hard drive. Reverse this procedure to install a new hard drive. To remove the touchpad support bracket and touchpad board, first remove the base enclosure, the battery, and the hard drive bracket assembly. Detach the 4 Phillips No. 1 screws securing the touchpad support bracket to the top cover. Lift the bracket off of its alignment pins and remove it from the unit. Flip up the latch for the touchpad board flat ribbon connector on the board. Carefully and gently pry the flat ribbon connector adhesive off of the board and use the blue pull tab to gently pull the connector out of its port on the board. Caution: take care to use minimal force on the flat ribbon connector to avoid damaging the connector and ribbon cable. Detach the 3 Phillips No. 0 screws that secure the touchpad board to the top cover. Grasp the edges of the touchpad board and lift it off of its alignment pins to remove it from the unit. Reverse this procedure to install a touchpad board and touchpad support bracket. To remove the card reader board, first remove the base enclosure, the battery, and the hard drive bracket assembly. Flip up the latch for the card reader board flat ribbon connector on the board. Carefully and gently pry the flat ribbon connector adhesive off of the board and gently pull the connector out of its port on the board. Caution: take care to use minimal force on the flat ribbon connector to avoid damaging the connector and ribbon cable. Pry off the foil tape covering the edge of the board. Detach the 2 wide head Phillips No. 1 screws securing the card reader board to the top cover. Pull the card reader board out of the unit. Reverse this procedure to install a card reader board. To remove the wireless LAN board, first remove the base enclosure and the battery. Pry off the piece of mylar covering the wireless LAN antenna connectors on the board, and reserve the mylar. Make a note of the antenna assignments on the board. The antenna labeled 1 should be installed in the port marked 1 on the board. Caution: use care when disconnecting the wireless antenna cables from the wireless LAN board. Damaged cables of connectors can degrade notebook performance. Carefully detach the wireless LAN antennas from the board by pulling the antennas straight up. Detach the Phillips No. 1 screw that secures the wireless LAN board in the unit. The screw edge of the board will release up. Grasp the edges of the board and pull it out of its motherboard socket. Reverse this procedure to install a wireless LAN board. To remove the USB board, first remove the base enclosure, the battery, and the hard drive bracket assembly. Detach the 2 Phillips No. 1 screws that secure the K-lock bracket over the USB board. Pull the K-lock bracket off of the USB board and out of the unit. Flip up the latch for the small, flat ribbon power board connector on the USB board. Gently pull the connector out of its port on the board. Flip up the latch for the large flat ribbon connector on the board. Use the blue pull tab to pull the connector out of its port on the board. Caution: take care to use minimal force on the flat ribbon connectors to avoid damaging the connectors and ribbon cables. Detach the Phillips No. 1 screw that secures the USB board to the top cover. Pull the USB board out of the unit. Reverse this procedure to install a USB board. To remove the power board, first remove the base enclosure, the battery, the CPU fan, the hard drive bracket assembly, and the USB board. Flip up the latch for the small flat ribbon connector on the board. Gently pull the connector out of its port on the board. Caution: take care to use minimal force on the flat ribbon connector. Detach the Phillips No. 0 screw securing the power board to the top cover. Lift the board off of its alignment pins and remove it from the unit. Reverse this procedure to install a power board. To remove the M.2 SSD drive, first remove the base enclosure and the battery. Detach the Phillips No. 1 screw securing the M.2 drive in place. Tilt up the edge of the drive. Grasp the edges of the drive and remove the drive from its motherboard socket. Reverse this procedure to install a new M.2 SSD drive. To remove either memory module, first remove the base enclosure and the battery. To remove the SO-DIMM memory module from either memory socket, gently pull out on the retaining lever located on each side of the module. The module will pop up from its socket. Caution: when handling a memory module, use care to prevent touching the memory chips on the board. Touching the chips could damage or destroy the memory. Grasp the edges of the module and pull the memory module out of the socket. Reverse this procedure to install a new memory module. To remove the motherboard, first remove the base enclosure, the battery, the VGA fan, the CPU fan, the heatsink, the hard drive assembly, and the wireless LAN board. If you are replacing the motherboard, instead of removing it for access to other system components, remove the M.2 SSD drive and memory modules. Note, the M.2 SSD drive and memory modules may be left on the board if the motherboard is being removed for access to other system components instead of being replaced as a component itself. Lift up the latch for the large flat ribbon connector on the USB board. Pull the connector out of its port on the board. And carefully peel the connector adhesive and the blue sponge on top of it from the top cover up to the motherboard. Caution: use care to avoid damaging the flat ribbon cable. Lift up the latch for the flat ribbon connector on the SD card reader board and gently pull the connector out of its port on the board. Caution: use care to avoid damaging the flat ribbon cable. Peel off the black mylar tape over the keyboard connector on the motherboard. Lift the latch for the keyboard connector. Pull the keyboard connector out of its motherboard port. Lift the latch for the keyboard light connector and pull the keyboard light connector out of its motherboard port. Lift the latch for the touchpad board connector on the motherboard and pull the touchpad board connector out of its motherboard port. Lift the latch for the audio board connector on the motherboard and remove the audio board connector from its motherboard port. Caution: use care to avoid damaging the flat ribbon cables. Peel back the mylar covering the EDP connector on the motherboard. And disconnect the EDP connector from the motherboard. Remove the 7 Phillips No. 1 screws that secure the motherboard to the top cover. Carefully pull the motherboard up and out of the unit. If replacing the motherboard, remove the USB board and the SD card reader board connectors from the underside of the motherboard and reserve for the replacement board. Reverse this procedure to install a motherboard. To separate the panel assembly and base assembly to service some components, first remove the base enclosure, the battery, the VGA fan, the CPU fan, and the heatsink. Detach the EDP connector from the motherboard. Remove the 4 Phillips No. 1 screws for each hinge on the base assembly, 2 small head screws, and 2 wide head screws for each hinge. Open the base assembly away from the panel assembly and carefully lift the base assembly off of the panel assembly hinges. Reverse this procedure to reconnect the base assembly to the panel assembly. To remove the speaker, first remove the base enclosure the battery, the VGA fan, the CPU fan, the heatsink, the hard drive assembly, and the wireless LAN board. Remove the motherboard from the top cover. Detach the Phillips #1 screw that secures the speaker to the top cover. Pull the speaker out. Reverse this procedure to install a speaker. To remove the top cover with keyboard, first remove the base enclosure, the battery, the VGA fan, the CPU fan, and the heatsink. Separate the panel assembly from the base assembly. Remove the hard drive assembly, the wireless LAN board, the motherboard assembly, the USB board, the power board, the audio board, the SD reader board, the touchpad bracket and touchpad module, and the speaker from the top cover and keyboard. Reverse this procedure to install a top cover with keyboard. To remove the LCD bezel, open up the laptop and rest the unit on the back cover. Carefully pry off the inside edges of the bezel from the top, sides, and bottom until the bezel is released and can be completely pulled off of the LCD panel. Reverse this procedure to install an LCD bezel. To remove the hinges, first remove the base enclosure, the battery, the VGA fan, the CPU fan, and the heatsink. Separate the panel assembly from the base assembly. Remove the LCD bezel from the panel assembly. Detach the 4 wide head Phillips #1 screws that secure each hinge to the top cover. Pull the hinges off from the back cover. Note that each hinge is marked L and R for correct installation. Reverse this procedure to install the hinges. To remove the hinge brackets, first remove the base enclosure, the battery, the VGA fan, the CPU fan, and the heatsink. Separate the panel assembly from the base assembly. Remove the LCD bezel from the panel assembly. Remove the hinges. Detach the Phillips #1 screw for each hinge bracket at the bottom of the LCD panel. Carefully pull out each hinge bracket from the panel assembly, being careful of the wireless LAN cables. Reverse this procedure to install hinge brackets. To remove the LCD panel, first remove the base enclosure, the battery, the VGA fan, the CPU fan, and the heatsink. Separate the panel assembly from the base assembly. Remove the LCD bezel from the panel assembly. Remove the hinges, and the hinge brackets from the panel assembly. Detach the Phillips #1 screw for each back cover support bracket at the sides of the LCD panel. Carefully pull out on each back cover support bracket from the sides of the LCD panel. There are two pieces of tape behind the panel. Grasp the tab end of each piece of tape at the bottom of the panel and pull firmly until all of the tape has come out from behind the LCD panel. Carefully rotate the LCD panel out away from the back cover. Disconnect the panel connector to the webcam board. Pry off the webcam connector adhesive from the rear of the LCD panel and pull away from the panel. Peel back the tape covering the display panel connector on the panel. And remove the display panel connector from the panel. Reverse this procedure to install an LCD panel and back cover support brackets. To remove the wireless LAN antennas, first remove the base enclosure, the battery, the VGA fan, the CPU fan, and the heatsink. Separate the panel assembly from the base assembly. Remove the LCD bezel. The hinges. The hinge brackets. And the back cover support brackets. Remove the LCD panel from the back cover. Carefully peel back the tape, securing each antenna to the back cover. Remove the antenna cabling from the cable guides on the back cover, and remove the antennas from the unit. Reverse this procedure to install wireless LAN antennas. To remove the webcam, first remove the LCD bezel. Starting at the right side of the webcam, carefully pry the webcam off of the back cover, peeling off the foil tape covering the edges. Peel back the tape covering the webcam connector and detach the connector from the webcam to fully remove the webcam from the unit. Reverse this procedure to install a webcam. To remove the webcam board, first remove the LCD bezel. Flip up the latch for the panel connector to the board and gently pull the connector out of its port on the board. Peel away the foil tape from the rear of the webcam board. Peel back the tape covering the webcam connector on the board. Disconnect the webcam connector and remove the board from the unit. Reverse this procedure to install a webcam board. To remove the back cover, first remove the base enclosure, the battery, the VGA fan, the CPU fan, and the heatsink. Separate the panel assembly from the base assembly. Remove the LCD bezel. The hinges. The hinge brackets. the back cover support brackets, the LCD panel, the wireless LAN antennas, the webcam, and the webcam board from the back cover. Reverse this procedure to install a back cover.